The emergency council meeting had been called at dawn, but Admiral Sarah Chen was already dressed and ready. She stood at the massive viewing window of the orbital station, watching the distant flashes of weapons fire illuminate the darkness of space. Another war had begun. The 37th conflict this year alone across the galaxy's outer rim territories. "Admiral, they're requesting your presence immediately," came the voice of her aide, Lieutenant Morrison. The young officer's face was pale with worry. Sarah had seen that look countless times before, the expression of someone who believed the universe was falling apart around them. Sarah turned from the window, her weathered hands clasped behind her back. At 53 years old, she had spent more time in space than most people spent breathing. Her short gray hair was perfectly neat despite the early hour, and her uniform bore the weight of dozens of medals and commendations. But it was her eyes that truly told her story. They held the tired wisdom of someone who had seen too much death and destruction. The council chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 12 different species argued in overlapping translations. The Zephyrians were clicking their mandibles in rapid succession, a sign of extreme agitation. The crystalline Helix delegates pulsed with angry red light, while the fur-covered Montari were growling low warnings in their throats. At the center of it all sat the human delegation, looking remarkably calm despite the chaos around them. "Order! Order!" shouted Ambassador Kathesk, the Galactic Council's current rotating president. His blue-scaled head bobbed frantically as he tried to restore peace to the room. "We must address the situation in the Kepler sector before it spreads further." Sarah entered quietly, her boots making soft sounds against the polished floor. Conversations began to die down as delegates noticed her presence. She had that effect on people, a gravity that drew attention without demanding it. She took her seat at the human delegation table, nodding politely to her colleagues. "The Vrex Empire has launched a full assault on the Mineral Alliance colonies." Ambassador Kathesk continued, his voice strained. "Early reports suggest they're using banned plasma weapons against civilian populations. The Alliance has called for immediate intervention." A Zephyrian delegate rose, its insect-like form towering over the table. "This is precisely what we predicted would happen. The human so-called peaceful solutions have only delayed the inevitable. Violence is the only language these species understand." Murmurs of agreement rippled through several delegations. Sarah listened without expression, her fingers steepled before her. She had heard these arguments before in dozens of similar meetings, facing hundreds of similar crises. "What does Admiral Chen recommend?" asked Ambassador Kathesk, turning to the human section. All eyes focused on Sarah as she slowly stood. "I need to see the battlefield first," she said simply. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber despite its quiet tone. "Every conflict has its own personality, its own rhythm. You cannot prescribe medicine without examining the patient." The Helix delegate pulsed with impatient yellow light. "Admiral, with respect, we don't have time for your usual methods. The death toll is climbing by the hour. The Vrex fleet outnumbers the Alliance 3-1. They need military support, not philosophy." Sarah met the crystalline being's gaze steadily. "How many wars has the Council ended through military intervention in the past decade?" Silence fell over the chamber. The answer was uncomfortable. Military solutions had a tendency to create new problems, new enemies, new cycles of violence that lasted for generations. "And how many conflicts has Admiral Chen resolved?" asked Ambassador Reeves, the senior human diplomat. His question was rhetorical. Everyone in the room knew the answer. 36 successful peace negotiations in 5 years. 36 wars ended without a single shot fired by human forces. The Montari representative, a large female with silver-streaked fur, leaned forward. "Your record is impressive, Admiral, but these are different times. The Vrex have been building their military for decades. They respect only strength," Sarah nodded slowly. "Every aggressor believes they respect only strength, Ambassador Furthek. But strength takes many forms. The strongest current in a river is often the one you cannot see." She moved to the central display table, her hands dancing over the holographic controls. The room darkened as a three-dimensional map of the Kepler sector materialized above them. Red dots marked Vrex positions, blue showed Alliance forces, and pulsing orange indicated active combat zones. "The Vrex Empire spans 47 star systems," Sarah began, highlighting regions on the map. "Their military doctrine emphasizes rapid expansion and resource extraction. But look at their supply lines. Golden threads appeared, connecting Vrex forces to their home territory. They're stretched incredibly thin. This isn't conquest, it's desperation. The room began to stir with interest. Several delegates leaned forward, studying the display more carefully. Their homeworld's primary sun is entering an unstable phase, Sarah continued. Stellar output has decreased by 12% over the past 5 years. Their agricultural yields are failing, their energy production is insufficient, and their population is growing restless. This war isn't about expansion, it's about survival. Ambassador Cathesk's scales shifted to a thoughtful purple. You're suggesting they're not acting from strength but from fear? I'm saying they're drowning, and drowning people will grab onto anything to stay afloat even if it pulls others under with them. Sarah manipulated the display again, showing resource flows and trade routes. The Alliance controls 3 systems rich in rare Earth elements that could power new stellar generators. From the Vrex perspective, this isn't aggression, it's a rescue mission for their entire species. The Zephyrian delegate clicked its mandibles skeptically. Even if that's true, Admiral, they're still killing innocent civilians. Good intentions don't justify mass murder. No, they don't, Sarah agreed. But understanding the disease helps us find the cure. Military action will only confirm their worst fears, that the galaxy sees them as disposable. It will push them toward even more desperate measures. She turned to face the full assembly. Give me 72 hours. Let me take a small diplomatic vessel to the combat zone. Not to negotiate surrender or peace terms, but to understand what we're really dealing with. If I'm wrong, you can proceed with military intervention. But if I'm right... She paused, looking at each delegation in turn. We might save not just the Alliance colonies, but the entire Vrex civilization as well. The chamber erupted in debate once again, but Sarah could see the change in their voices. Where there had been only fear and anger before, now there was something else, hope. It was a small flame, barely visible, but she had learned to nurture such sparks into something much larger. Outside the viewing window, the flashes of distant battle continued to light up the darkness. But for the first time since the crisis began, Sarah Chen smiled. The diplomatic shuttle Harmony dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the combat zone, its hull scarred from a dozen previous missions. Sarah stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display as red and blue dots danced their deadly ballet across the star system. The ship's captain, a grizzled veteran named Martinez, shook his head at the readings. Ma'am, I've got 17 active engagements in this sector alone, he reported. Vrex battle cruisers are hammering the Alliance defensive. Positions around Kepler 7, the colonists are trapped on the surface with no way to evacuate. Sarah studied the patterns of movement on the screen. Most military commanders would see chaos, but she saw something else entirely. A carefully orchestrated desperation. The Vrex weren't fighting like conquerors. They were fighting like people who had nothing left to lose. Captain, take us toward the largest Vrex formation, she ordered. I want to speak with their fleet commander. Lieutenant Morrison, who had insisted on accompanying the mission despite Sarah's protests, looked up from his console with alarm. Admiral, that's a suicide run. They'll blast us to atoms before we can transmit a greeting. No, they won't, Sarah said with quiet confidence. Look at their weapon signatures. Those are mining lasers retrofitted for combat. Industrial plasma cutters mounted on civilian hulls. Half their warships are converted freighters and colony vessels. They're not a military force. They're refugees with guns. The shuttle moved deeper into the battle zone, its diplomatic transponder broadcasting on all frequencies. Sarah had ordered the ship's shields lowered and weapons powered down, a gesture that would either save lives or end hers. Several Vrex fighters peeled off from the main formation to intercept them, but as she predicted, they held their fire. Incoming transmission, reported the communications officer, a young ensign named Park. It's coming from the Vrex flagship. Audio and visual. The main screen flickered to life, revealing a Vrex commander unlike any Sarah had encountered before. Where most Vrex were tall and imposing, with their characteristic blue-black scales and predatory features, this one appeared almost gaunt. His scales had lost their natural luster, and his large eyes were sunken with exhaustion. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much death. I am War Leader Thex High of the Vrex Combined Fleet, he said in heavily accented but clear standard. You pilot a human vessel into our operational zone. State your purpose before I am forced to destroy you. Sarah stepped forward, ensuring she was visible on the transmission. War Leader HFY, I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. I request permission to come aboard your vessel under flag of truce. I believe we have much to discuss. The Vrex commander's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. You are the human who ended the Centauri rebellion? The one they call the Peacebringer? I'm a human who prefers talking to fighting, Sarah replied. Your people are in pain, War Leader. I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice. This war isn't what you wanted. It's what you felt you had to do. HFY was silent for a long moment, his clawed hands gripping the arms of his command chair. Behind him, Sarah could see other Vrex officers watching the exchange with intense interest. Their uniforms were patched and worn, their equipment obviously jury-rigged from whatever materials they could find. You know nothing of our situation. Human, HFY said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. The Alliance has resources we need. They refuse to trade fairly. We take what we must to survive. Your homeworld's sun is dying, Sarah said gently. Your people are starving. Your government sent you here not to conquer, but to save your species. How many of your warriors have families back home who are counting on this mission to succeed? The effect of her words was immediate and visible. Several Vrex officers exchanged glances, and Sarah saw one of them wipe moisture from his large eyes. HFY himself seemed to deflate slightly, as if a great weight had settled on his shoulders. How do you know these things? He whispered. Because I've been where you are, Sarah replied. Different species, different circumstances, but the same desperate love for people who are depending on you. The same terrible choice between honor and survival. May I come aboard, War Leader? Not as an enemy, not as a judge, but as someone who understands. The transmission cut abruptly, leaving the bridge of the Harmony in tense silence. Minutes passed without response, and Sarah could feel the anxiety radiating from her crew. In the distance, the battle continued to rage around the Alliance defensive positions. Admiral, Captain Martinez said quietly, their weapons are powering up. Multiple targeting locks on our position. Sarah didn't move from her position. Hold course, Captain. Hold steady. Ma'am, with respect, they're about to blow us apart. No, Sarah said, her voice filled with certainty. They're thinking. HFY is a good commander caught in an impossible situation. He's weighing his options, considering his people's future. Give him time. The targeting locks held for another 30 seconds, then suddenly disappeared. A new transmission came through. Coordinates for a docking bay aboard the Virex flagship. And a single word. Come. The trip across open space to the Vrex vessel gave Sarah time to observe their fleet more closely. What she saw confirmed her suspicions. These weren't military ships in any traditional sense. They were colony vessels, industrial platforms, even what appeared to be converted passenger liners. All of them showed signs of hasty modification and hard use. Families were fighting this war, not just soldiers. The docking bay of the flagship was a study in barely controlled chaos. Vrex technicians worked frantically to repair damaged systems, while medical teams tended to wounded crew members. Children, actual Vrex younglings, could be seen in the corridors, their large eyes wide with fear and confusion. This wasn't a military operation. It was an evacuation that had turned violent out of necessity. War Leader HFY met her at the airlock, flanked by 4 guards but making no hostile gestures. Up close, Sarah could see that his uniform had been mended multiple times, and that the decorations on his chest were not military honors but family totems, small carved images that represented loved ones back home. Admiral Chen, he said formally, welcome aboard the vessel Destiny's Edge. I must warn you that my hospitality has limits. My people are dying while we speak. Then let's not waste time with ceremonies, Sarah replied, falling into step beside him as they walked through the ship's corridors. Show me what you're really fighting for, War Leader. Help me understand. They passed through sections of the ship that had been converted into makeshift refugee quarters. Vrex families huddled together in spaces never meant for habitation, their few possessions piled around them. Elders told stories to wide-eyed children, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in the midst of chaos. The air recycling systems were clearly overtaxed and the lighting was dim to conserve power. 3 billion Vrex remain on our homeworld, HFY said as they walked. Our sun grows weaker each day. Crops fail. The ice caps advance toward our major cities. Our scientists estimate we have perhaps 5 years before our civilization collapses entirely. They entered what had once been the ship's main dining hall, now converted into a strategic planning center. Holographic displays showed not battle plans but resource calculations, population figures, and environmental data. Sarah studied the information with growing understanding and sadness. The Alliance worlds have the technology and materials to build stellar regeneration stations, HFY continued. We offered to trade our labor, our cultural artifacts, even our territorial claims to other systems. They refused every proposal. Because they're afraid of you, Sarah said quietly. The Vrex Empire has a reputation for military strength. They see your desperation as aggression, your requests as demands. HFY's laugh was bitter. Military strength? Look around you, Admiral. These are farmers and teachers, engineers and artists. We took every ship we could find and gave them whatever weapons we could manage. We called it a fleet because we had no other choice. Sarah moved to the central display, her mind racing through possibilities. War leader, what if I told you there was another way? A path that could save your people without destroying the Alliance colonies. For the first time since she'd met him, HFY's eyes showed genuine hope. Sarah spent the next 6 hours aboard the Vrex flagship, moving through different sections and speaking with crew members at every level. She listened to the chief engineer explain how they had converted cargo haulers into warships using salvaged components. She sat with families in the refugee quarters, hearing stories of the world they had left behind. Most importantly, she observed how the Vrex interacted with each other, their gestures of comfort, their shared meals, their quiet moments of hope and despair. War leader HFY accompanied her throughout the tour, initially suspicious but gradually warming to her genuine interest in his people's plight. When they reached the ship's observation deck, he finally asked the question that had been weighing on him since her arrival. Why are you here, Admiral Chen? Your reputation suggests you could negotiate peace between these forces. But what do you gain from it? Humans have no stake in this conflict. Sarah gazed out at the stars, watching the distant flashes of combat that continued to rage across the system. War leader, may I tell you about a place called Syria? HFY's expression showed confusion. I am not familiar with this world. It was a region on Earth centuries ago during my people's early industrial period, Sarah began. A terrible civil war raged there for years. Millions of people fled their homes, becoming refugees in neighboring countries. The international community debated endlessly about military intervention, about sanctions and blockades. They argued about who was right and who was wrong while children starved in refugee camps. She turned from the window to face him directly. One day, a human aid worker named Dr. Elena Vasquez decided she couldn't wait for the politicians to solve the problem. She took a medical team into the most dangerous part of the conflict zone, not to fight or take sides, but simply to treat the wounded. She saved hundreds of lives before she was killed by a stray artillery shell. HFY listened intently, his large eyes reflecting the starlight from outside. She sacrificed herself for people who were not her own. Dr. Vasquez understood something that took my species far too long to learn, Sarah continued. Suffering is suffering, regardless of which side causes it or which species experiences it. When you have the power to reduce pain in the universe, you have a responsibility to use it. That's why I'm here, War Leader, not because humans have anything to gain, but because we have something to give. A soft chime interrupted their conversation, followed by the voice of the ship's communications officer over the intercom. War Leader, we are receiving a priority transmission from the Alliance defensive positions. They are requesting to speak with the human admiral. HFY and Sarah exchanged glances. Patch it through to the observation deck, HFY ordered. The transmission came through as audio only, the voice heavily distorted by interference from the ongoing battle. Admiral Chen, this is General Morrison of the Alliance Defense Force. We know you're aboard the Vrex flagship. What is your status? Sarah recognized the name. General Morrison was Lieutenant Morrison's father, a career military officer known for his direct approach to problem-solving. She activated the transmission pickup with a gesture. General Morrison, I'm aboard the Vrex vessel Destiny's Edge as a diplomatic observer. I'm safe in conducting negotiations under flag of truce. Admiral, with all due respect, this is not the time for negotiation. Morrison's voice crackled through the speakers. Vrex forces have begun bombardment of civilian evacuation sites on Kepler 7. We have refugees trapped on the surface with nowhere to run. I need to know if you can guarantee a ceasefire while we extract our people. Sarah looked at HFY, whose expression had hardened. General, let me speak with War Leader HFY about this immediately. Stand by. She cut the transmission and turned to the VREX commander. War Leader, are your forces targeting civilian evacuation sites? HFY's claws clicked against the deck plating as he paced. The Alliance has been using civilian facilities to hide military installations. Our intelligence indicates that those evacuation sites contain weapons depots and command centers. We cannot allow them to regroup while our people suffer. Show me, Sarah said simply. They moved quickly to the tactical center, where HFY called up sensor data from the surface of Kepler-7. The images were grainy and hard to interpret, but Sarah could make out large buildings surrounded by what appeared to be defensive positions. However, her trained eye also noticed something else. The irregular patterns of movement around the structures, the presence of smaller buildings that looked like temporary shelters. War Leader, these sensor readings are partially correct, she said carefully. There are military assets in these locations, but look at these thermal signatures. She highlighted sections of the display. These indicate large numbers of people, more than you would expect from a military garrison. I believe these are genuine refugee camps that have been co-located with defensive positions. HFY studied the data more carefully, his expression troubled. You are suggesting the Alliance is using their civilians as shields? I'm suggesting that in war the line between civilian and military infrastructure often becomes blurred, Sarah replied. Especially when people are desperate and running out of options. Both sides are making choices they would never consider in peacetime. The communication system activated again, this time with urgent transmission from one of the VREX attack squadrons. War Leader, Squadron 7 reports that Alliance fighters are launching from the southern evacuation site. They request permission to commence bombardment. Sarah felt the moment crystallizing around them. Within minutes, the situation would escalate beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. She looked at HFY, seeing the weight of impossible decisions in his eyes. War Leader, give me 1 hour, she said urgently. 1 hour to prevent this from becoming a massacre. Your people have survived for millions of years. Surely your cause can survive 60 more minutes. HFY was silent for a long moment, then activated his communicator. Squadron 7, hold position. Do not engage unless directly fired upon. War Leader out. He turned back to Sarah. 1 hour, Admiral. But if the Alliance launches a major assault during that time, I will have no choice but to respond. Sarah was already moving toward the communication station. General Morrison, this is Admiral Chen. I need to speak with whoever is commanding the evacuation operations on Kepler-7. Admiral, that would be Colonel Hayes, Morrison replied. But our communications with the surface are limited due to atmospheric interference. I can patch you through, but the connection may not be stable. Do it, Sarah said. The next few minutes passed in a haze of technical adjustments and communication attempts. Finally, a new voice came through, younger and more strained than General Morrison's. Admiral Chen, this is Colonel Hayes. I have to tell you, the situation down here is deteriorating rapidly. We have over 10,000 civilian refugees and limited defensive capabilities. If the VREX press their attack, we can't protect these people. Colonel, I need you to be completely honest with me, Sarah said. Are there military assets co-located with your evacuation sites? A pause. Admiral, we had to make hard choices. We couldn't abandon our defensive positions, but we also couldn't abandon the civilians. We've tried to keep military and civilian areas separate, but in a crisis, separation becomes impossible, Sarah finished. Colonel, I understand. Now I need you to trust me. I'm going to ask you to do something that goes against every military instinct you have. War Leader HFY watched Sarah with intense interest, clearly listening to both sides of the conversation. What do you need, Admiral? Colonel Hayes asked. I need you to power down your military installations, Sarah said. All of them. Weapons offline, shields down, fighters grounded. I need you to make your evacuation sites genuinely civilian. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Colonel Hayes spoke again, his voice was tight with disbelief. Admiral, that would leave us completely defenseless. If the VREX attack after we power down, it will be a slaughter. Sarah looked directly at HFY as she responded. Colonel, I'm betting my life and the lives of 10,000 refugees that the VREX are not the monsters we've made them out to be. But you need to make this gesture of trust first. On the tactical display, she could see the Alliance defensive positions, small blue dots scattered across the surface of Kepler-7. As she watched, one by one, those dots began to fade as weapon systems went offline. The tactical display showed the Alliance positions going dark one by one, their defensive systems powering down in a gesture of trust that was either brilliant or suicidal. Sarah watched War Leader Thexhai's face as the Vrex commander studied the readings, his expression cycling through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. "They are truly disarming?" Thexhai asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This could be a trap." "It could be," Sarah agreed. "But look at the pattern. If this were a military deception, they would maintain some systems online for rapid reactivation. Instead, they're powering down everything. Weapons, shields, even their communication arrays. This is complete vulnerability." The bridge of the Destiny's Edge had fallen silent as Vrex officers gathered around the tactical display. Sarah could see the conflict in their faces. These were people who had been preparing for a desperate assault, psychologically armored for violence they didn't want but felt they needed. Now they were faced with something they hadn't expected: trust. Squadron 7's commander came over the communication system again. "War Leader, Alliance positions have gone completely dark. We have clear approaches to all target zones, requesting immediate attack authorization." Thexhai's hand hovered over the communication controls. Sarah could see the weight of his people's survival pressing down on him. The knowledge that this might be their only chance to secure the resources they desperately needed. But she could also see something else in his eyes. The recognition that the Alliance's gesture had changed the fundamental nature of this moment. "Squadron 7, maintain position," Thexhai ordered finally. "Continue monitoring, but do not advance." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Trust was fragile, and both sides were still armed and desperate. She activated the communication link to Colonel Hayes on the surface. "Colonel, this is Admiral Chen. Your gesture has been received and acknowledged. War Leader Thexhai has ordered his forces to hold position. We now have a window of opportunity, but we need to move quickly." "Admiral, I hope you know what you're doing," Hayes replied, his voice tight with tension. "My people are exposed down here. If this goes wrong..." "It won't go wrong, Colonel, because we're not going to let it," Sarah said firmly. "Now I need information. What exactly do you need to complete your evacuation?" "We need transport capacity for 10,000 people and safe passage to the outer system," Hayes responded immediately. "Our evacuation ships were damaged in the initial attack. We have maybe half the capacity we need." Sarah turned to Thexhai, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. "War Leader, your fleet is primarily composed of converted civilian vessels. You must have substantial passenger capacity." "We do," Thexhai said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "But Admiral, you cannot be suggesting what I think you are suggesting." "I'm suggesting that the solution to both your problems might be each other," Sarah said. "Your people need the Alliance's resources and technology. The Alliance needs evacuation capacity and safe passage. What if instead of fighting over those resources you shared them?" The Vrex bridge erupted in clicks and hisses as officers began discussing the proposal in their native language. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Excitement mixed with disbelief. Hope tempered by suspicion. Thexhai raised a clawed hand for silence. "Admiral, even if such a thing were possible, the Alliance has already refused our trade proposals." "Why would they agree now?" "Because now they understand what you're really asking for," Sarah replied. "Before they saw the Vrex Empire making demands. Now they see families trying to survive. Perspective changes everything." She activated the communication link again. "General Morrison, are you monitoring this conversation?" "Yes, Admiral," Morrison's voice came through clearly. "And frankly, I'm not sure what to make of it. Are you seriously proposing that we cooperate with the forces that were shooting at us an hour ago?" "General, I'm proposing that you help save an entire civilization while they help save your people," Sarah said. "The Vrex have the ships to evacuate your refugees. They have the workforce to help build the infrastructure you need. In return, the Alliance has the technology and resources the Vrex need to survive their stellar crisis." A new voice joined the conversation, Ambassador Kathesk from the Galactic Council. "Admiral Chen, the Council has been monitoring this situation. We have a fleet standing by to enforce military intervention if necessary. Are you telling us that such intervention is no longer required?" Sarah looked at Thexhai, seeing the question in his eyes. The war leader stepped forward and activated his own communicator. "Galactic Council, this is War Leader Thexhai of the Vrex Combined Fleet," he said formally. "I am prepared to discuss immediate cessation of hostilities and cooperative evacuation operations contingent upon Alliance agreement to resource-sharing negotiations. The communication channels buzzed with overlapping voices as various commanders and officials tried to process this unexpected development. Sarah moved to the central tactical display and began highlighting different positions. "Here's what I propose," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. Vrex vessels immediately moved to support evacuation operations on Kepler-7. Alliance forces provide technical assistance and resource access for Vrex stellar regeneration projects. Both sides established joint working groups to develop long-term cooperation agreements. "Admiral," Colonel Hayes interrupted, "with all due respect, this sounds like you're asking us to trust the people who were trying to kill us this morning." "No, Colonel," Sarah replied. "I'm asking you to trust the people who were trying to save their families this morning." "There's a difference." She turned to address the full assembly of voices on the communication network. "Every person in this conversation has someone they care about. Someone they would fight to protect. Someone they would die to save. The Vrex are not monsters, they're parents and children and partners and friends who are watching their world die. The Alliance forces are not oppressors, they're people trying to protect their own families and homes." The tactical display began to shift as she spoke, showing not just military positions but population centers, resource flows, and potential cooperation zones. What if instead of seeing each other as enemies, we see each other as people with complementary needs? The Vrex have skills, ships, and workforce. The Alliance has technology, resources, and infrastructure. Together they have the solution to both their problems. War Leader Thexheim moved to stand beside Sarah at the display. "Admiral Chen speaks wisdom," he said. "My people are engineers, miners, agricultural specialists. We could help build the installations you need while learning the technologies we require. This could benefit both our civilizations." General Morrison's voice came through the speakers, thoughtful now rather than hostile. "It's an interesting proposal, Admiral. But even if we agree to this in principle, how do we implement it? How do we go from shooting at each other to working together in a matter of hours?" "We start with the evacuation," Sarah said. "Vrex ships begin immediate transport of Alliance refugees to safety. Alliance technicians begin assessment of Vrex stellar regeneration needs. Each side demonstrates good faith through concrete actions, not just words." Squadron 7's commander broke into the conversation. "War Leader, Alliance evacuation ships are beginning to launch from Kepler-7. They appear to be genuinely civilian vessels, not military transports. Copy that, Squadron 7. Move to escort positions and offer assistance with traffic control," Thexhigh ordered. "All weapons to standby mode." Sarah felt the momentum of the moment carrying them forward. Around the bridge of the Destiny's Edge, Vrex officers were working with growing enthusiasm, coordinating with their scattered fleet to begin evacuation support operations. The atmosphere had changed from desperate military operation to humanitarian rescue mission, but she knew that trust built quickly could also shatter quickly. The real test would come when both sides had to fulfill their promises under scrutiny from their own people in the watching galaxy. 3 weeks after the ceasefire, Sarah stood in the converted cargo bay of the Alliance Station New Hope, watching an unprecedented sight. Vrex engineers worked alongside Alliance technicians, their different approaches to problem-solving creating solutions neither species could have achieved alone. The air hummed with the sound of universal translators, and the occasional burst of laughter as cultural barriers dissolved through shared work. Lieutenant Morrison approached her with a datapad, his young face still showing amazement at the transformation. "Admiral, the evacuation statistics are remarkable. We've relocated over 50,000 Alliance civilians from the combat zones, and the Vrex fleet has integrated seamlessly with our logistics network." Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on a group near the far wall, where a Vrex family was teaching Alliance children a traditional hand-clapping game. The universal nature of childhood play had bridged a gap that diplomacy alone never could have managed. "What about the long-term negotiations?" she asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Morrison replied, consulting his datapad. "The joint working groups have identified 17 areas of potential collaboration. The Vrex Stellar Regeneration Project is actually ahead of schedule, because Alliance quantum physicists found a way to enhance Vrex gravitational manipulation techniques." Sarah smiled at that. It was always the technical people who adapted fastest to cooperation. Engineers spoke a universal language of problem-solving that transcended species barriers. War Leader Thexhigh approached from across the bay, his uniform now bearing Alliance Cooperation insignia, alongside his traditional Vrex rank markers. In the weeks since the ceasefire, he had been transformed from a desperate military commander into something resembling a diplomat, though Sarah suspected he would always be more comfortable with direct action than endless meetings. "Admiral Chen," he said formally, then switched to the more personal tone they had developed. "Sarah, I wanted to inform you personally. We have received confirmation from our homeworld. The first stellar regeneration station has begun operation. The initial energy output readings exceed our most optimistic projections." The relief in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah had seen that same expression on the faces of hundreds of negotiators when they realized their people would survive, their families would be safe, their world would continue to exist. "Congratulations." "Thexai," she said warmly. "Your people must be celebrating." "They are, but they also understand the debt we owe," he replied. "Not just to the Alliance for their technology, but to humanity for showing us there was another way. My mate has asked me to invite you to visit our homeworld when the regeneration project is complete. She wants our children to meet the human who saved their future." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with moments like these. It was gratitude mixed with humility, the recognition that she had been privileged to witness something remarkable. "I would be honored, Thexai." Ambassador Kathesk's distinctive blue form appeared at the entrance to the cargo bay, moving with the urgent gait that meant he brought news from the Galactic Council. Sarah and Thexai moved to meet him, their easy cooperation a symbol of how much had changed in such a short time. "Admiral Chen." "War Leader Thexai," Kathesk said, his scales shimmering with excitement. "I bring greetings from the full council. The Vrex Alliance cooperation accords have been ratified by unanimous vote. More importantly, the council has decided to establish the Chen Protocol as standard practice for conflict resolution." Sarah blinked in surprise. "The Chen Protocol?" "A formal diplomatic procedure based on your methods," Kathesk explained. "Deep cultural assessment, identification of underlying needs rather than stated positions, and the search for mutual benefit rather than zero-sum solutions. We are creating training programs for diplomatic personnel throughout the galaxy. Ambassador, I'm flattered, but I should point out that these methods aren't new," Sarah said. "They're based on centuries of human diplomatic experience, adapted for interspecies relations." "Perhaps," Kathesk replied, "but you have demonstrated their effectiveness on a scale we had not previously imagined. In the past month, 3 other conflict zones have requested human diplomatic intervention based on your success here." War Leader Thexai stepped forward. "Admiral, there is something else. The Vrex High Council has voted to establish a permanent exchange program with the Alliance. Our young people will study at their academies and theirs will learn from our masters. But they have also voted to create something unprecedented in our history." He paused, clearly struggling with the magnitude of what he was about to say. "They are creating the first Vrex diplomatic corps, not military commanders or trade negotiators, but specialists in peaceful conflict resolution. They want humans to train our first generation of peacemakers." Sarah felt the weight of that request. It represented a fundamental shift in how an entire species understood their place in the galaxy. The Vrex had been known for their military prowess for millennia, and now they were choosing to become known for something entirely different. "Thexai, that's a tremendous honor, but also a huge responsibility," she said carefully. "Training diplomats isn't just about teaching techniques. It's about changing how people think about conflict itself." "We understand," he replied. "That is why we are asking for humans to lead the program. Your species has shown us that strength and peace are not opposites, that the greatest victory is sometimes preventing the battle from happening at all." A soft chime echoed through the cargo bay, followed by an announcement that made Sarah's heart skip. "Admiral Chen, please report to Communications Center 1. Priority transmission from Earth Command." Sarah exchanged glances with her companions. Communications from Earth were rare in the outer sectors, and priority transmissions usually meant either very good news or very bad news. She made her way to the communications center with Thexai and Kathesk following, their conversation continuing as they walked. The communications center was a small, efficient space filled with monitors and transmission equipment. The duty officer, a middle-aged Alliance technician named Reeves, looked up as they entered. "Admiral, we have Secretary General Williams on the line from Earth. It's marked urgent and personal." Sarah took a seat at the main console, gesturing for her companions to remain. The screen flickered to life, revealing the familiar face of humanity's senior diplomatic leader. Rebecca Williams had been Secretary General for 8 years, and Sarah had worked under her guidance on dozens of missions. "Sarah," Williams said without preamble, "I need to speak with you privately about a new assignment." Sarah glanced at HFY and Kathesk, who immediately moved to leave the room. "Stay," she said. "Whatever Earth Command has to say, these people have earned the right to hear it." Williams raised an eyebrow at that but continued. "Very well, Sarah. The success of your mission in the Kepler sector has attracted attention at the highest levels. We have a situation developing in the Andromeda approach that threatens to destabilize the entire outer rim. Multiple species, complex territorial disputes, and the potential for a galactic war unlike anything we've seen in generations." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and dread. Each successful mission seemed to lead to a more complex challenge, as if the universe were testing the limits of what peaceful resolution could accomplish. "What makes this different from previous conflicts?" she asked. "Scale," Williams replied grimly. "We're not talking about 2 or 3 species in a localized dispute. This involves 7 major civilizations, 3 minor powers, and territorial claims that span over 40 star systems. The Galactic Council is preparing for the possibility that military intervention may be inevitable." War Leader HFY stepped forward, making himself visible on the transmission. "Secretary General Williams, War Leader HFY of the Virex Combined Fleet. If I may respectfully suggest, Admiral Chen has proven that even the most seemingly impossible conflicts can be resolved through understanding and cooperation." Williams studied HFY with interest. "War Leader, your transformation from military commander to diplomatic advocate has been noted throughout the galaxy. Are you suggesting that the Andromeda situation can be resolved peacefully?" "I am suggesting that Admiral Chen should be given the opportunity to try," HFY replied firmly. "My people learned that our greatest enemy was often our own assumptions about our enemies. Perhaps the species of Andromeda will learn the same lesson." Sarah looked at the faces around her, the hope in HFY's eyes, the thoughtful calculation in Kathesk's expression, the trust and confidence in Lieutenant Morrison's young features. These people believed in something she had helped create, a new way of thinking about conflict and cooperation. The Andromeda approach mission took 18 months and nearly killed Sarah twice. The conflict involved species so alien to each other that basic communication required revolutionary advances in xenolinguistics. The Christine Collective thought in geological timescales and couldn't understand the urgency that drove carbon-based life forms. The swarm mind spoke only in chemical pheromones and considered individual consciousness a form of mental illness. The ancient builders had transcended physical existence centuries ago and viewed the territorial disputes as children fighting over toys. Sarah spent weeks learning to think in crystal harmonics, months developing chemical vocabularies that could bridge species with no common reference points. She mediated between beings of pure energy and creatures that existed only in hive minds. She negotiated territorial agreements between species that measured space in different dimensions and time in incompatible scales. When it was over, when the 7 major civilizations had signed the Andromeda Compact and agreed to the first interspecies development consortium in galactic history, Sarah Chen had become something unprecedented. Not just a diplomat, but a translator between different forms of consciousness itself. The Galactic Council formally recognized her as the first xenological peace specialist, and requests for her intervention began arriving from across the galaxy. For the next 15 years, Sarah traveled from crisis to crisis, each one more complex than the last. She prevented the Spiral Arm War by discovering that 3 species were actually fragments of a single ancient civilization that had forgotten their common origin. She ended the trade route conflicts by establishing the first interspecies economic framework that accounted for radically different concepts of value and exchange. She stopped the religious wars of the Outer Nebula by finding the common spiritual principles that connected 6 different forms of transcendent experience. With each success, her methods became more refined, her understanding deeper. She trained hundreds of diplomats, established peacekeeping protocols that became standard throughout civilized space, and created the theoretical framework for what scholars would later call consciousness-based conflict resolution. Universities across the galaxy offered courses in Chen methodology, and her writings on Interspecies understanding became required reading for anyone working in diplomatic service, but success came with a price. Sarah aged in ways that went beyond mere years. The mental strain of constantly adapting to alien thought patterns, of holding multiple incompatible worldviews in her mind simultaneously, began to take its toll. She developed what physicians called cognitive displacement syndrome, moments where she would temporarily lose the ability to think in purely human terms. Lieutenant Morrison, now Captain Morrison, and her permanent aide watched her with growing concern as they traveled to their 43rd major negotiation. She would sometimes respond to his questions in Vrex clicking sounds, or pause mid-sentence to calculate her thoughts in the mathematical concepts that the builders used for communication. "Admiral," he said carefully as they approached the Tau Ceti system for the next crisis, "perhaps it's time to consider training a successor. You've proven these methods work. Others can carry on the mission." Sarah looked up from her preparation materials, her eyes taking a moment to focus on his purely human features. "James, do you know what the Christine Collective calls me?" "No, ma'am. The frequency between frequencies. To them, I'm not a being at all, but a harmonic resonance that allows different consciousness types to synchronize." She smiled, but there was something distant in her expression. "Sometimes I think they might be right." The Tau Ceti crisis involved a species that existed in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. The Chronarchs could perceive past, present, and future as a single moment, and their territorial claims included events that wouldn't happen for thousands of years. Negotiating with them required Sarah to develop an entirely new mental framework, one that nearly shattered her sense of linear causality. When the agreement was finally reached, a temporal territorial compact that satisfied beings existing across multiple timelines, Sarah collapsed in her quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel. Captain Morrison found her 3 days later, conscious but unable to speak in any language that existed in the present tense. The medical team at Galactic Central took 6 months to restore her ability to think in linear time. When she emerged from treatment, she was different. Still brilliant, still capable of the empathetic leaps that made her negotiations successful, but increasingly detached from her own humanity. "I think it's time," she said to Captain Morrison as they stood in the recovery center, watching ships move through the space lanes outside. "Time to step back and let others carry the work forward." Morrison felt relief mixed with sadness. "What will you do, Admiral?" "Teach," she said simply. "Train the next generation. Write down everything I've learned before I forget how to think like a human being." Sarah Chen retired from active diplomatic service at the age of 68, after personally resolving 57 major interspecies conflicts and training over 300 diplomatic specialists. She established the Chen Institute for Consciousness Studies on the peaceful world of New Geneva, where students from dozens of species came to learn the art of thinking like their enemies in order to find common ground. For 10 years, she taught and wrote and guided a new generation of peacemakers. Her students went out into the galaxy and prevented wars that might have consumed entire sectors. The techniques she developed became so fundamental to interspecies relations that violent conflict between civilized species became increasingly rare. But even as her influence spread, Sarah herself began to fade from public attention. The galaxy had moved beyond the need for a single miraculous negotiator. The systems she had created were working, the institutions she had founded were thriving, and the new generation of diplomats were handling crises with skills that built upon but surpassed her own. When Sarah Chen died quietly in her sleep at the age of 79, the news barely registered in the galactic media. There were brief obituaries in the diplomatic journals, formal acknowledgments from the governments she had served, and modest memorial services at the institutions she had founded. Captain Morrison, now Admiral Morrison and head of the Human Diplomatic Corps, gave the eulogy at the main service. He spoke to a small gathering of former students, old colleagues, and a few representatives from the species she had helped save. War leader Thexhai was there, now ancient himself and serving as the Vrex ambassador to the Galactic Council. Ambassador Kathesk attended, his scales now faded with age but his respect undimmed. Sarah Chen saved countless lives, Morrison said as he stood before the modest memorial. She prevented wars that would have destroyed civilizations. She changed how we think about conflict itself, but perhaps her greatest achievement was making herself unnecessary. She built a galaxy where peace is possible, where understanding trumps violence, where different species can work together instead of destroying each other. As the ceremony concluded and the small crowd dispersed, few of them realized they were witnessing the end of an era. Sarah Chen had been the bridge between the old galaxy of constant warfare and the new galaxy of cooperative exploration. She had been the translator who taught different species to understand each other, the teacher who showed the way to peace. Within a generation, her name would begin to fade from common knowledge. The crises she had resolved would be remembered as historical events, but the woman who had resolved them would become just another entry in the diplomatic archives. New challenges would arise and new heroes would emerge to meet them. The galaxy had moved beyond Sarah Chen, just as she had always intended it should. 200 years after Sarah Chen's death, Dr. Elena Vasquez Prime was researching her doctoral thesis on historical conflict resolution methodologies when she stumbled across a single line in the Galactic Diplomatic Archives. Chen, Sarah, human, see references 2387-2441, Xenological Peace Specialist, deceased. Elena was a third-generation student at the Chen Institute, though like most current students, she had only a vague understanding of who the Institute's founder had been. The official histories mention Sarah Chen briefly as an early pioneer in interspecies diplomacy, but most academic attention focused on the more recent theorists who had refined and expanded her work. Curious about this mysterious founder, Elena began digging deeper into the archives. What she found astonished her. The woman dismissed in modern textbooks as an early pioneer had personally resolved more major conflicts than the entire current diplomatic corps handled in a decade. The techniques that were now considered fundamental principles of peacemaking had been revolutionary innovations when Sarah Chen first developed them. Professor Martinez, Elena said to her thesis advisor, "I think we need to completely revise our understanding of early diplomatic history." Professor Martinez, a distinguished Xentorian scholar whose crystalline features reflected the afternoon light through his office windows, examined Elena's research with growing interest. His species thought in geological timescales, so the idea that important historical contributions might be forgotten in mere centuries struck him as particularly tragic. "This is remarkable work, Dr. Vasquez Prime," he said, his harmonic voice resonating through the translation matrix. "But I must warn you that challenging established historical narratives is dangerous for a young scholar's career." Elena had expected that response. Academic institutions, even those dedicated to peace and understanding, could be surprisingly territorial about their accepted truths. "Professor, look at these conflict resolution statistics. The century following Chen's retirement shows a dramatic decline in interspecies warfare. The correlation is undeniable." Professor Martinez rotated his crystalline head to examine the data from multiple angles, a habit of his species when considering complex information. "You are suggesting that a single individual's influence reshaped galactic civilization?" "I'm suggesting that we've forgotten someone who deserves to be remembered," Elena replied. "Someone who quite literally saved countless lives and changed the course of history." Her research expanded beyond a doctoral thesis into what would become a landmark historical reassessment. Elena spent 3 years tracking down surviving records, interviewing the few remaining individuals who had known Sarah Chen personally, and reconstructing the true scope of her achievements. The hardest part was finding people who remembered Sarah as a person rather than a historical figure. Most of her former students had died decades earlier. War leader Thex Hai's descendants maintained family records that mentioned Sarah, but the details had become mythologized over generations. The clearest picture came from an unexpected source, Captain Morrison's personal journals, discovered in his family's archives on Earth. Morrison had kept detailed records of his years serving under Sarah Chen, and his writings revealed the human cost of her unprecedented success. Elena read accounts of Sarah's gradual transformation from a brilliant diplomat into something almost beyond human comprehension, her growing ability to think like alien species coming at the price of her own identity. "She paid a price that no one should have to pay," Morrison had written near the end of his journals. "She gave up pieces of herself to understand others, until I sometimes wondered if there was enough of Sarah Chen left to remember who she had been before she became what the galaxy needed." Elena's research culminated in a comprehensive biography titled The Frequency Between Frequencies, Sarah Chen and the Foundation of Modern Peace. The book created a sensation in academic circles and sparked a broader re-examination of early galactic history. Universities began offering entire courses on Chen's methodology, and her writings were republished in modern editions. But the most significant impact came from an unexpected quarter. The current Galactic Council, facing a crisis unlike anything seen in 2 centuries, found themselves turning to Sarah Chen's methods for guidance. The crisis began in the outer spiral, where first contact protocols had encountered something unprecedented, a collective intelligence that spanned multiple star systems and communicated through gravitational wave manipulation. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed completely, as the entity didn't recognize individual consciousness as legitimate. It viewed all separate beings as incomplete fragments of a larger mind that should be absorbed into its collective. Ambassador Tavel of the current diplomatic corps requested access to Sarah Chen's complete archives, including her personal notes on consciousness-based negotiation. What she found there was a theoretical framework for exactly the kind of contact they were facing. She anticipated this, Tavel reported to the council. Chen's later writings include extensive speculation about collective intelligences and how to establish communication protocols with beings that don't recognize individual existence. The negotiation with the outer spiral entity took 6 months and required a team of diplomats trained specifically in Chen's advanced techniques. The breakthrough came when they stopped trying to convince the entity to recognize individual minds and instead presented civilization itself as a form of collective intelligence, a meta-consciousness composed of multiple species. Working together, the entity understood this concept and agreed to establish formal relations with what it termed the small collective. The agreement prevented what could have been the most devastating war in galactic history, as the entity's control over gravitational forces could have destabilized entire star systems. Following this success, the Galactic Council commissioned a complete review of Sarah Chen's contributions to diplomatic theory. The review concluded that her work had been so far ahead of its time that many of her insights were only now becoming relevant as galactic civilization encountered increasingly complex forms of consciousness. Elena Vasquez Prime was appointed to head the new Sarah Chen Historical Research Project, with a mandate to ensure that the diplomats' contributions would never again be forgotten. The project established memorials, endowed permanent academic positions, and created the Chen Prize for Diplomatic Innovation. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was simpler and more practical. The Galactic Diplomatic Service instituted a new tradition. Every graduating class of diplomats would study one of Sarah Chen's actual negotiations in detail, learning not just her techniques but understanding the human cost of bridging different forms of consciousness. On the wall of every diplomatic corps training facility, they installed a simple plaque with a quote from Sarah's final lecture at the Chen Institute. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. And understanding requires us to become more than we were, to think thoughts that were not originally our own, to see through eyes that evolved under different stars. Below the quote, in smaller text, was a single line that ensured Sarah Chen would never again be reduced to a mere footnote in history. Admiral Sarah Chen, 23872466. She taught the galaxy to think like its enemies in order to love them instead. The galaxy had indeed moved beyond Sarah Chen, but now it remembered why that movement had been possible. Her methods had become so fundamental to galactic civilization that they were like gravity, invisible, taken for granted, but absolutely essential. She had not just prevented wars, she had changed the fundamental nature of how different forms of consciousness could relate to each other. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest tribute of all. Sarah Chen had succeeded so completely in her mission that for 2 centuries, the galaxy had forgotten it had ever needed her at all. The peace she had built was so strong, so well-founded, that it seemed natural and inevitable, rather than the miraculous achievement it had actually been. Now, as new challenges arose that required her insights once again, the galaxy remembered, not just the techniques she had developed or the institutions she had founded, but the essential truth she had embodied, that understanding between different forms of consciousness was not just possible, but absolutely necessary for survival in a universe vast enough to contain wonders beyond imagination. Sarah Chen had ended countless wars by teaching the galaxy a simple lesson. There is no enemy so alien that they cannot be understood, no consciousness so different that it cannot be reached, no conflict so fundamental that it cannot be resolved through empathy, patience, and the willingness to become more than you were before. That lesson lived on, carried forward by thousands of diplomats who had never known her name, but practiced her principles every day. In the end, what more could any teacher ask for than to see their work continued by students who surpassed them? Their ideas so thoroughly absorbed that they became part of the fundamental structure of civilization itself? Sarah Chen had become more than a historical figure. She had become a way of thinking, the approach to existence, a permanent part of how the galaxy understood itself. She had achieved a form of immortality that no monument could provide,